The children were directly beneath my landing gear. I was less than 30 seconds from touching down on my private grass runway when a bright yellow playground roof appeared beneath the nose of my plane. Then I saw the swings. A little girl was running toward them. Two parents stood beside a new pavilion. A contractor was raising a section of metal fencing directly inside my approach corridor. None of it had been there when I took off that morning. I shoved the throttle forward and pulled back hard. The engine roared as the aircraft climbed over the playground, clearing the new fence by far less distance than I ever wanted to see. People below began pointing at me. One woman grabbed her child and screamed, as if I had deliberately flown at them. But I had not flown over their playground. The HOA had built a playground beneath the approach path of an active runway. That airstrip had been on my family's land for decades. My father had cleared it before Willow Creek Estates had streets, houses, or an HOA president pretending to control everything beyond its decorative stone entrance. I circled once, landed from the opposite direction, and drove straight to the construction site. The concrete was still wet. Contractors were installing benches while families wandered through an area that had apparently opened before the work was even finished. The tallest section of fencing stood precisely where an aircraft would descend toward the eastern end of my runway. When I ordered the contractor to stop, he showed me a signed authorization from the Willow Creek HOA. Patricia Caldwell arrived 20 minutes later wearing a white blazer and carrying a folder thick enough to suggest she had been expecting this confrontation. She did not apologize. She accused me of endangering children. Patricia announced in front of the contractors and several residents that the playground was legally built on HOA property. Then she told me my backyard landing strip had no right to interfere with a community recreation area. I reminded her that the runway had existed long before the subdivision. She smiled. Then perhaps it's time you stopped using it. 3 days later, the HOA's attorney sent me a formal demand ordering me to suspend every takeoff and landing immediately. The letter claimed my aircraft created an unacceptable risk to children and warned that the board would seek an emergency injunction if I used the runway again. Patricia also emailed the entire neighborhood. She described me as a reckless pilot, refusing to put children's safety ahead of his hobby. By that evening, residents were parked outside my gate, taking photographs of my plane. Someone placed a sign along my fence that read, "Children before airplanes." What Patricia never mentioned was that the HOA had approved the playground without contacting me, reviewing the runway's history, or asking why that section of land had remained completely empty for decades. So I stopped arguing. I photographed every post, fence panel, roofline, and freshly poured slab. I saved Patricia's emails. Then I pulled my father's survey, my deed, the original subdivision plat, and a sealed folder that had not been opened since Willow Creek Estates was first approved. 3 weeks later, a county official arrived at the playground carrying an old recorded document. Patricia was already there with the HOA attorney, still insisting that the playground was legal and my runway had to close. The official examined the fence, measured its distance from the runway, and unfolded the document across the hood of his truck. Then he pointed to one line Patricia had apparently never seen. Her attorney read it twice. The color drained from Patricia's face, and when the county official asked who had authorized construction inside that marked area, every contractor on the playground suddenly stopped working. I had never thought of the airstrip as something that made me special. To me, it was simply part of home. My father bought the property when I was still a kid, nearly 30 acres of open ground bordered by pasture, tree lines, and an old county road. He worked with his hands, fixed almost everything himself, and spent years saving for a small single-engine airplane. The grass runway came later, carved out slowly across the flattest section of the land until it became a clean, narrow strip long enough for the kind of aircraft he flew. Some of my earliest memories were tied to that field. I remembered helping him drag branches away after storms, repainting the wind marker, mowing the grass until the strip looked almost unnaturally straight against the rest of the property. After he died, I kept the place much the way he had left it. I repaired the workshop, maintained the fences, paid the taxes, and continued flying a few times a month. I was not running a flight school. I was not operating a commercial airport. I did not have crowds of airplanes coming and going. Most weekends, the runway sat completely silent. I worked as an industrial equipment technician and spent more time repairing machinery than flying. When I did take the airplane up, I tried to be considerate. I avoided early mornings. I stayed away from late evenings. I kept my pattern as predictable as possible and made every reasonable effort not to create unnecessary noise over nearby homes. For years, there were barely any nearby homes to worry about. The eastern side of my property had once been farmland. Then a developer bought a large section of it and announced plans for a subdivision called Willow Creek Estates. I did not fight the project. I understood that land changed. Farms were sold. New families moved in. Roads appeared where fields used to be. I had no interest in becoming the man who tried to stop every house simply because I had been there first. I had only one concern. The airstrip had to remain usable. During the early planning stages, representatives for the developer knew it existed. Survey crews crossed nearby parcels. Planning documents were filed. Roads, drainage areas, lots, and common spaces were mapped out around property that had been used for private aviation long before Willow Creek had a name. At the time, I was told the airstrip had been considered in the development plans. That was enough for me. For the first year after families began moving in, things stayed relatively peaceful. Then the HOA became more active, and Patricia Caldwell became its president. Complaints slowly began appearing. First, the HOA asked whether I could avoid flying early in the morning. I already did. Then they wanted fewer weekend flights. I reduced them anyway, mostly because I wanted to be a decent neighbor. Then the tone changed. The airstrip began appearing in HOA emails as a neighborhood concern. Board members started describing it as incompatible with a growing residential community. What had once been polite requests gradually became expectations, and every compromise I made seemed to convince them that they were entitled to another one. That was when I began paying closer attention. There is a difference between trying to live peacefully beside your neighbors and quietly surrendering rights you legally own. At the time, I still believed the disagreement could be handled reasonably. I had no idea the HOA was preparing to use the very land beside my runway to make continued flying almost impossible. If you have ever watched an HOA turn a neighbor's courtesy into something it believes it can enforce, leave your thoughts in the comments. Stories like this are worth sharing because sometimes the smallest property dispute reveals how quickly people can forget where their authority actually ends. I learned that lesson the morning heavy equipment showed up beyond my eastern fence line, and when I later opened the original subdivision records, I discovered the developer had known far more about my runway than Patricia ever admitted. The heavy equipment arrived on a Tuesday morning. I was halfway through replacing a hydraulic pump in my workshop when I heard the low, grinding sound of machinery coming from beyond the eastern edge of my property. At first, I assumed it was road work inside Willow Creek Estates. Construction crews had been moving in and out of that subdivision for months. Then I stepped outside and saw the excavator. It was working almost directly beyond the end of my runway. By noon, several trucks had arrived. Workers unloaded lumber, fencing sections, playground equipment, concrete forms, and pallets of landscaping material. Orange stakes marked out a rectangular area beside the approach path, and a temporary sign identified the project as the Willow Creek Family Recreation Area. I called the HOA office immediately. No one returned my message. I sent an email asking for the site plan and requesting that work stop until the airstrip approach area could be reviewed. That message was ignored too. The next morning, the excavation was deeper. By the third day, concrete was being poured. That was when I drove over and photographed everything from the public side of the subdivision. I measured distances from landmarks I already knew. The closer I looked, the worse it appeared. The playground itself was only part of the problem. A pavilion was being placed higher than the surrounding equipment. A metal perimeter fence was planned along the edge closest to my property. Young trees had been planted in a neat line, exactly where future growth could create an even larger obstruction. I still did not know whether any of it technically crossed my property line. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. It affected the safe use of my runway. I sent Patricia Caldwell another written notice. This time she replied. Her response was brief and dismissive. The HOA owned the common parcel. The board had approved the project. The recreational area served dozens of homeowners. My objections, she said, did not give me authority over HOA land. That part sounded reasonable enough. Then she added something else. She wrote that the board had been discussing my airstrip for months and believed the new playground made continued flight operations increasingly inappropriate for a residential community. That sentence changed everything. Until then, I had been willing to believe the playground placement was careless. Now it sounded intentional. The HOA was not merely ignoring my runway. It was building something beside it and then using that construction as a reason the runway should stop operating. Within a week, Willow Creek announced the playground project in its community newsletter. The message described the area as a safe gathering place for children and families and praised the board for transforming previously unused land into a valuable neighborhood amenity. There was no mention of the airstrip, no mention of the approach path, no mention of the fact that airplanes had been using that location long before the subdivision existed. Then the social media posts began. Residents who had never spoken to me personally began describing the runway as reckless. Some said they could not believe anyone was legally allowed to land an airplane so close to homes. Others demanded that the county shut it down before someone got hurt. The story being created was simple. There was a playground full of children on one side, and one stubborn man with an airplane on the other. It was an effective image. It was also deeply misleading. I suspended flights from the eastern approach while I tried to understand what had been built. I did not want even the appearance of taking unnecessary risks. The HOA treated that decision like a confession. At the next board meeting, Patricia told homeowners that I had already reduced flight operations because even I understood the danger. That was not why I had stopped. I had stopped because they had created the danger. A few days later, a certified envelope arrived at my house. It came from an attorney representing Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. The letter accused my aircraft operations of interfering with the peaceful enjoyment of the community and creating an unreasonable safety concern near a recreational area used by children. It demanded that I cease using the eastern approach immediately and strongly encouraged me to discontinue operations from the property altogether. It also warned that if the HOA was forced to seek injunctive relief, it would pursue every legal remedy available. I read the letter twice, then a third time. The people who had chosen to place a playground beside an established runway were now threatening to sue me because a playground existed beside the runway. For the first time, I understood what Patricia was really trying to accomplish. She did not need to seize my land. She only needed to make using it difficult enough, expensive enough, and politically ugly enough that I would give up. So I stopped responding emotionally. I stopped trying to convince the board that their decision made no sense. I stopped caring about the neighborhood comments. Instead, I created a folder on my computer and began saving everything. Every HOA email, every photograph, every certified letter, every project announcement, every image showing where the equipment, fence, pavilion, and trees had been placed. I recorded the dates construction began and the dates I suspended flight operations. I downloaded copies of the HOA newsletters. I saved screenshots of board statements describing the runway as dangerous after the playground had already been approved. And then I went looking for the documents that mattered more than anyone's opinion. The deed, the surveys, the subdivision plat, the permits, because somewhere beneath all the accusations and angry neighborhood posts was a much simpler question. What, exactly, had the HOA been legally allowed to build there? And what had the developer promised the county before Willow Creek Estates ever existed? I started with the deed. It was the most obvious place to begin, but the least dramatic. Just pages of legal descriptions, parcel references, signatures, recording stamps, and language I had seen before without ever studying closely. For years, those documents had lived in a metal filing cabinet in the back corner of my office. Now they mattered. I spread the deed, my father's old survey, tax maps, and a copy of the Willow Creek subdivision plat across a worktable and began comparing them line by line. At first, nothing jumped out. The playground was not sitting on my parcel. That much became clear quickly. The HOA had not simply crossed my property line and built on my land. If they had, the dispute would have been easier. The problem was more complicated. On my father's survey, there was a long, narrow area extending east from the runway. It was marked differently from the property boundaries, almost like a corridor laid over the neighboring parcel. I had seen it before. I had just never understood what it meant. So, I called a licensed surveyor named Mark Ellis. Mark had worked in the county for more than 20 years. I gave him copies of everything I had and asked him one question. I wanted to know whether the playground violated anything attached to my property rights. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he visited the site. He located old survey monuments, compared them with the subdivision plat, checked the county GIS system, and measured the relationship between the runway, the playground, the pavilion, the fence, and the newly planted trees. A few days later, he came to my workshop with a rolled-up map under his arm. The first thing he told me was that the playground appeared to be inside the HOA's common parcel. That was not what I wanted to hear. Then, he pointed to the corridor. He explained that property ownership and land use rights were not always the same thing. A person could own land while still being subject to an easement recorded against it. That word changed the entire direction of my search. Easement. Mark had found a notation referencing an aviation-related restriction, but the plat did not contain the complete language. The original document had been recorded separately years earlier. That meant I needed the county records. The next morning, I drove to the county recorder's office. I expected a quick search. It took most of the day. The property had changed hands more than once. Parcel numbers had been adjusted, larger tracts had been divided. Old recording references led to other documents, and those documents led to older ones. Eventually, a clerk helped me trace the chain back to the period when my father still owned the airstrip and the neighboring land was undeveloped. Then she found it, a recorded aviation and navigation easement. I read the first page standing at the counter. Then I read it again. The document created a protected corridor connected to the operation of the airstrip. It described rights associated with aircraft approach and departure and imposed restrictions on certain obstructions within a defined area. More importantly, it had been recorded against the neighboring land. That meant selling the land did not automatically erase it. The developer had purchased property already burdened by that recorded interest. Willow Creek Estates had been built on land that came with a condition attached. I asked for certified copies. Then I requested the subdivision approval file. That search produced something even more interesting. The developer's planning materials referenced the existing airstrip. The recorded corridor appeared on earlier versions of the site documents. There were planning notes showing that the county had been aware of it when the subdivision was reviewed. The runway had not been some surprise the HOA discovered after families moved in. It was part of the land use history of the project. I kept digging. I requested records related to the playground, site plans, permit applications, inspection records, anything showing whether the pavilion, fence, landscaping, or equipment had gone through the proper review. The more documents I compared, the stranger the situation became. The simplified plan used by the HOA for the recreation area did not clearly show the aviation corridor. The older subdivision documents did. I could not tell whether someone had intentionally removed it from consideration or whether the board had simply relied on incomplete plans. Either possibility was bad. I also reviewed every email Patricia had sent me. I printed them in chronological order. At the beginning, the HOA described the airstrip as a noise concern. Later, it became a safety concern. After the playground was approved, the language became more aggressive. Now the HOA was treating the existence of children near the runway as a reason the runway should shut down. The timing mattered. I created a timeline. Dates of HOA complaints. Dates of playground approval. Dates construction began. Dates I suspended the eastern approach. Dates the attorney letters arrived. Dates of public statements. I saved screenshots of the neighborhood posts, but I did not focus on insults or angry comments. I focused on statements made by board members. Those were potentially important. Then, I contacted a property attorney. Her name was Rebecca Sloan. I sent her the deed, the survey, the recorded easement, the subdivision plat, the HOA letters, the construction photographs, and Mark's preliminary measurements. She reviewed everything before we met. When I sat down in her office, I expected her to tell me to sue. She did not. She told me to keep collecting evidence. That was the moment I realized this dispute was larger than a playground. Rebecca explained that if the easement remained valid and if the HOA had placed prohibited obstructions inside the protected corridor, the board could have a serious problem. But she wanted facts, not assumptions. So Mark returned to the site for more precise measurements. He documented the location and height of the pavilion, the fence, the playground equipment, the young trees. He tied those measurements back to the recorded corridor. At the same time, Rebecca requested additional county planning records. One afternoon, she called me. Her voice sounded different, more focused. She had found a reference in an old planning file showing that the developer had been specifically notified about the aviation corridor during the subdivision approval process. Not just generally. Specifically, that meant the developer had known. And if those obligations had transferred with the common property, the HOA could not simply pretend the restriction no longer existed. I sat in my workshop that evening surrounded by copies of documents that had been sitting in public records for years. Patricia had spent months acting like the board had more authority than I did. But authority was not decided by who sent the most threatening letter. It was decided by what had been recorded, approved, and attached to the land. And now I had a reason to believe Willow Creek's playground was standing inside a restriction the HOA should have found before the first shovel ever touched the ground. The only thing left was to determine exactly how damaging that mistake could become. Rebecca called me the next morning and asked me to come to her office. She had the county file open on her desk when I arrived. The page she wanted me to see was not the easement itself. It was older subdivision correspondence between the developer and the county planning department. One note referenced the airstrip directly. Another referred to preserving the recorded aviation corridor as part of the development approval. That changed the situation. Until that moment, the HOA could still argue that the easement was obscure, outdated, or misunderstood. Now there was evidence that the developer had known about it while Willow Creek Estates was being approved. The restriction had not been buried in some forgotten corner of the title history. It had been part of the planning process. Rebecca explained it carefully. The HOA could own the parcel. That did not mean it could ignore every recorded burden attached to that parcel. Ownership was not unlimited. The playground might sit entirely inside HOA property lines and still violate rights that had existed before the subdivision was built. Mark's updated survey made the problem even clearer. He overlaid the recorded corridor onto current conditions. The pavilion was inside it. Part of the metal fence was inside it. Several pieces of playground equipment extended into it. The line of young trees followed the edge closely enough that their future height could become another issue. The HOA had not taken my land. It had done something more complicated. It had used its own land in a way that appeared to conflict with a recorded restriction protecting the airstrip. That distinction mattered. Rebecca drafted a formal demand letter. Unlike Patricia's letters, ours contained almost no emotion. It identified the recording information. It referenced the subdivision plat. It attached the relevant survey measurements. It requested that the HOA immediately suspend use of the affected portion of the playground while the matter was reviewed. It also demanded copies of all permits, design documents, engineering plans, contractor instructions, and board approvals connected to the project. We did not threaten to destroy the neighborhood. We did not demand millions of dollars. We did not accuse anyone of intentionally endangering children. We simply put the documents in front of them. Patricia's response arrived 4 days later. She dismissed the easement as an old private agreement that should not interfere with a modern residential community. She argued that conditions had changed. More homes existed now. More families lived nearby. The board, she claimed, had an obligation to prioritize current residents. Rebecca read the letter once and set it down. The age of a recorded easement, she explained, did not automatically make it disappear. And a board president could not erase a property right simply because she believed the neighborhood had outgrown it. Then something interesting happened. The HOA attorney stopped using Patricia's language. The next letter was more cautious. It requested additional time to review title documents and subdivision records. That was the first sign that someone on their side had finally understood what we had found. But Patricia still refused to close the playground. Instead, she called an emergency HOA meeting. According to a homeowner who later sent me the minutes, Patricia described the dispute as an attempt by an outside property owner to control community land through an obsolete aviation claim. She told residents the board intended to defend the playground. She also repeated that my runway posed a growing safety problem. That turned out to be a mistake, because by then, the county had already received our documentation. Rebecca had submitted a request for review to planning and code enforcement, attaching the recorded easement, the subdivision materials, Mark's measurements, and photographs of the finished structures. We also asked the county to verify whether every component of the recreation project had been properly reviewed under the subdivision conditions. A few days later, I received a call from a county planner. He had pulled the original Willow Creek approval file. He asked me to confirm the recording number for the easement. I gave it to him. There was a long pause. Then, he said the corridor appeared in the development records. Not only that, The file suggested that maintaining that corridor had been considered during the subdivision approval process. That was the legal turn I had been waiting for. The issue was no longer whether Patricia personally believed the easement was outdated. The issue was whether Willow Creek had built permanent recreational structures in an area that the county itself had expected to remain subject to aviation-related restrictions. Rebecca told me not to celebrate yet. There were still questions. The exact scope of the easement had to be interpreted. The county had to determine what permits applied. The measurements had to be verified. No one had ruled on anything, but the balance had changed. For months, Patricia had forced me to defend the existence of my runway. Now the HOA had to defend the placement of its playground. And the documents were doing something I never could have done by arguing at a board meeting. They were removing the dispute from Patricia's control. The most damaging discovery came 2 days later. The county planner located a condition in the subdivision record tying the development approval to compliance with previously recorded restrictions affecting that section of land. It did not mention Patricia. It did not mention the playground. It had been written years before either existed. But it meant Willow Creek's current board might be dealing with more than a disagreement between neighboring landowners. They might be dealing with a project that conflicted with the very conditions under which their development had been approved. That was when the tone changed completely. The HOA attorney requested a meeting. The contractor asked for copies of the survey. The board stopped posting public updates. And Patricia, for the first time since this started, stopped sending me personal emails. By then, the playground was still standing. The pavilion was still there. The fence was still there. The bright yellow roof was still visible from the end of my runway. But now every one of those structures represented a question the HOA could no longer answer with confidence. The next people to ask those questions would not be me. They would be county officials. The county visit happened on a gray Thursday morning. I knew they were coming, but I still felt something tighten in my chest when I saw the white county vehicle turn into Willow Creek Estates. A planning official stepped out first. A code enforcement inspector followed him. Mark was already there with his survey equipment, and Rebecca arrived a few minutes later carrying a folder thick enough to make the HOA board visibly uncomfortable. Patricia showed up with 2 board members and the HOA attorney. For once, no one was interested in speeches. The county official asked to see the site. We walked toward the playground. The bright equipment looked almost absurdly cheerful against the tension surrounding it. The pavilion stood over the seating area. The fence ran along the side closest to my property. The young trees were still small, but their placement was obvious. Patricia immediately began explaining that the HOA owned the land. The planning official agreed. Then he told her that ownership was not the issue under review. That sentence stopped her. Mark unrolled his survey across the hood of the county vehicle. He showed the current property lines first. Then he showed the recorded aviation corridor. Finally, he overlaid the locations of the playground structures. The pavilion crossed into the restricted area. Part of the fence did too. Several fixed pieces of equipment sat inside it. The landscaping plan placed future tree growth along the same corridor. The code enforcement inspector began taking photographs. He measured several structures himself. Then he asked the HOA for the approved site plan. The board produced a copy. The inspector studied it. Rebecca placed the older subdivision plat beside it. The difference was immediate. The older county record showed the aviation-related restriction. The simplified recreation plan did not clearly account for it. No one said anything for several seconds. Then the inspector asked for the permits associated with the pavilion and the permanent improvements. The HOA attorney handed him a packet. The county officials stepped away and reviewed it together. That was when I noticed Patricia was no longer looking at me. For months, she had treated me as the problem standing in the way of the community. Now she was watching 2 county employees compare her project against records created years before she became HOA president. The planning official asked when the board became aware of the aviation easement. Patricia said she had believed it was no longer relevant. He asked whether the board had obtained a formal determination saying that she did not have one. He asked whether the easement had been released. There was no recorded release. He asked whether the county had approved removal of the corridor from the subdivision conditions. Again, there was nothing. Then came the question that changed the entire tone of the inspection. If the board believed the easement no longer applied, Why had it placed a children's recreation area inside a corridor that remained visible in the recorded subdivision file? Patricia tried to return to the argument that my runway created the safety issue. The official did not accept that framing. The runway had existed before the subdivision. The corridor had been recorded before the playground. The county was not there to decide whether Patricia liked private aviation. It was there to determine whether Willow Creek had built fixed improvements in conflict with recorded land use restrictions and approved development conditions. That distinction was devastating. The HOA could no longer point at the playground and claim the runway had become unsafe without explaining who had chosen to place the playground there. The code enforcement inspector then identified another problem. Some of the information in the field did not appear to match the documentation provided for the project. That did not automatically mean every structure was illegal, but it was enough for him to issue a notice requiring the HOA to stop further work and suspend use of the affected area while the county completed its review. The playground was closed that afternoon. Yellow notice tape went across the entrance. For the first time since construction began, the site was quiet. Then another layer of scrutiny arrived. Because the dispute involved an active private airstrip and potential obstructions near an approach area, aviation safety concerns were referred for additional review. The aviation-related inspector who later examined the documentation did not declare that I could operate however I wanted. That was never the point. He reviewed the airstrip, the approach environment, the recorded corridor, and the newly constructed obstacles. The questions became technical. When had the airstrip been established? How long had the approach been used? What structures had existed before the subdivision? What restrictions were recorded? What had been added afterward? Every answer pushed the timeline in the same direction. The runway came first. The easement came first. The subdivision came later. The playground came last. That sequence mattered. The HOA attorney became noticeably quieter. The contractor requested copies of the county documents and began distancing itself from the site selection, pointing out that it had constructed the project based on plans provided by the HOA. The HOA's insurance carrier was notified. The developer's old planning records were requested again. What had started as Patricia threatening one property owner was becoming a chain of people asking who had approved what, who had known what, and who was going to pay if the project had to be moved. Then came the public meeting. The room was packed. Many homeowners had arrived expecting to hear another argument about my airplane. Instead, they saw copies of recorded documents projected onto a screen. They learned that the aviation corridor existed before Willow Creek Estates. They learned that the county had referenced it during subdivision approval. They learned that the playground had been closed because the board's project was under official review. The anger in the room changed direction. Residents wanted to know whether the board had checked the title restrictions before spending HOA money. They wanted to know why legal fees were already accumulating. They wanted to know whether the developer had disclosed the nearby airstrip when homes were sold. They wanted to know whether the playground would have to be moved. Patricia tried to explain that the board had acted for the benefit of families. That answer was no longer enough. A playground could be a good idea and still be built in the wrong place. By the end of the meeting, the same board that had spent months demanding that I justify my runway was being asked to justify its own decisions. I barely spoke. I did not need to. The county records were doing it for me. And within days, the HOA received the document Patricia had spent months insisting would never come. A formal notice requiring corrective action. The corrective action notice did not order the entire neighborhood torn apart. It did something much more precise. It required Willow Creek Estates to address the structures and landscaping that conflicted with the recorded corridor and to submit a compliant plan before the affected recreation area could reopen. The board had two choices: fight the county, fight me, keep paying attorneys, and risk making the dispute even more expensive, or move the playground. Within weeks, the HOA attorney contacted Rebecca about settlement. The tone was completely different from the first demand letter I had received. There were no accusations about reckless flying, no threats about shutting down my runway, no claims that the board could simply decide an old easement no longer mattered. Now they wanted terms. The final agreement allowed Willow Creek to keep a playground, just not where they had originally placed it. The pavilion was removed from the restricted area. The affected fencing was taken down and repositioned. Several pieces of equipment were relocated to another common parcel deeper inside the subdivision. The young trees planted near the corridor were removed before they could become future obstructions. The HOA formally withdrew its demand that I discontinue airstrip operations. It also agreed not to interfere with rights established by the recorded easement without going through the proper legal process. A portion of my legal and surveying expenses was reimbursed as part of the settlement. The HOA's insurance carrier became involved in the financial cleanup, while the board and contractor argued separately over who had relied on which site plan. The final bill was not something Patricia could hide behind a community newsletter. Homeowners saw the legal expenses. They saw the relocation costs. They saw money being spent twice on a project that should have been reviewed correctly the first time. That changed the board election. Patricia remained defensive until the end, but she lost support from people who had once believed the entire dispute was caused by one unreasonable pilot. At the next election, she did not return as HOA president. The new board took a much quieter approach. They reviewed title restrictions before approving new common area projects. They communicated with me directly when aviation questions came up. And the replacement playground opened in a location where children could use it without being placed beside an active runway approach. That was the outcome I had wanted from the beginning. I never wanted families to lose their playground. I never wanted to stop the subdivision from existing. I only wanted the rights attached to my property to be treated as real. A few months later, I used the eastern approach again. The yellow pavilion roof was gone. The tall fence was gone. The young trees were gone. From the cockpit, the corridor looked almost the way I remembered it before Willow Creek Estates had been built. The runway was still there. So was my house. So was the workshop where my father had taught me how to repair engines and machinery. Nothing about the victory felt dramatic in that moment. It felt quiet. And maybe that was the point. I did not win because I shouted louder than the HOA president. I did not win because I threatened anyone. I did not move their equipment in the middle of the night or retaliate against the people living next door. I kept the letters. I saved the photographs. I found the survey. I checked the county records. And I let the documents answer a question Patricia had never bothered to ask before construction started. What rights were already attached to that land? Property disputes can look personal when they begin. A fence, a driveway, a tree, a playground, a narrow strip of grass that someone else thinks should no longer matter. But sometimes the most important thing a property owner can do is stop arguing long enough to find out what the records actually say. If you think Willow Creek should have checked the easement before spending homeowners' money, leave your opinion in the comments. Share this story with someone who has dealt with an HOA, save the video in case you ever need a reminder to document everything, and subscribe for more stories about property rights, boundary disputes, permits, easements, and the moments when paperwork changes the entire balance of power.